Mrs. Johnson quickly sensed that something was amiss with her horse Daisy. The mare was behaving differently. She appeared restless and anxious. Although Mrs. Johnson had witnessed this kind of behavior before, it was typically associated with horses in labor, which puzzled her since Daisy had never shown any signs of pregnancy. As Daisy's condition continued to deteriorate, it became evident that she was, indeed, in labor. Everyone was surprised when the baby horse was finally born, but not for the reason you might think. After one last push, the baby horse's head and front legs came out, followed by the rest of its body. Daisy licked her baby clean and looked happy, but there was complete silence around her. Everyone stared at the baby horse in shock. No one expected it to look like this. The veterinarian, Dr. Thompson, looked pale. He hadn't said anything to the Johnson family yet. He just quietly packed his things. Dr. Thompson, Mrs. Johnson asked carefully, "Can you explain this?" But all he could do was mumble. "What is happening?" "Hi. I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry, but this isn't a baby horse." Mrs. Johnson was confused. Not a baby horse, she thought. What else could it be? What was wrong with Daisy's baby? Why was the veterinarian acting so strangely, and how did Daisy get pregnant in the first place? In a small town in the countryside, there was a simple farm owned by the Johnson family. They had run the farm for many years and were known for their love and care for their animals, especially their prized mare, Daisy. Daisy was a beautiful black horse with a gentle nature, and everyone in town adored her. She had never been used for breeding because the Johnsons kept her mainly as a pet. So it came as a great surprise one spring morning when they noticed Daisy acting strangely. She was pacing back and forth in her stall, whinnying and stomping her hooves on the ground, showing clear signs of distress. Mrs. Johnson, an experienced horsewoman, had seen this behavior before and suspected that Daisy might be in labor, which was very unusual since she hadn't shown any signs of being pregnant. The Johnsons immediately called the local veterinarian, Dr. Thompson, who rushed to the farm as fast as he could. He had been the Johnsons' trusted vet for many years and knew Daisy well. When he arrived, he was greeted by an anxious Mr. Johnson, who led him to Daisy's stall. Dr. Thompson quickly assessed Daisy's condition and could tell she was in labor and that the foal's arrival was imminent. Mrs. Johnson was baffled. No stallion had been in the same stall or even the same meadow as Daisy, so how could she have fallen pregnant? But she soon realized that was the least of her problems because Daisy was about to give birth, and she needed all the help she could get. Luckily, Dr. Thompson had brought all the necessary equipment and prepared everything for when he had to use it, but first, Daisy had to try on her own. Dr. Thompson stated that Daisy was only in the first stage of her labor process. It could take a few hours up to a day for active labor to start, so all they could do was wait. But Mrs. Johnson wasn't one to sit still. She had to know who impregnated Daisy. Maybe that could tell her more about the foal. They had hung cameras around the farm after another incident that took place many years before, so all Mrs. Johnson had to do was watch back the footage. And so she did. She scanned through the footage roughly back to when Daisy was supposedly impregnated. It wasn't long before Mrs. Johnson noticed something very strange. As she reviewed the footage, Mrs. Johnson's eyes widened in shock. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. On the night Daisy had supposedly been impregnated, she had been alone in her stall, but she saw something extraordinary on the video. Someone opened the gate, and a stallion walked in. Mrs. Johnson immediately knew this was a premeditated act, but who would do something like this and why? What were they getting out of it? She called her husband in, Dr. Thompson, and they gathered around the computer screen to watch the baffling footage together. Then she suddenly recognized the stallion. It was their neighbor's stallion, Rocky. Mrs. Johnson had noticed Rocky acting strangely a few weeks before, but she had never imagined he would be the culprit behind Daisy's pregnancy. When she looked closer, she noticed a woman had opened Daisy's stall for Rocky, which was strange since Rocky's owner was a widowed man. This raised even more questions, but Mrs. Johnson had no time to dwell on them as Dr. Thompson called her, saying Daisy was now in active labor. Mrs. Johnson quickly rushed back to Daisy's stall and saw her lying on the ground in distress. "It won't be long now," Dr. Thompson said with a smile on his face. You could see Daisy's abdominal muscles visibly contracting and relaxing, indicating she was experiencing strong rhythmic contractions. But Daisy didn't stay down on the ground. Instead, she rolled around, got up, paced the stall, and lay down again. She looked very restless. That would be over soon, or so they hoped. Daisy was breathing very heavily, and Mrs. Johnson worried about her precious horse. But Dr. Thompson assured her that everything would be fine. Mrs. Johnson knew she had to trust her vet, but she couldn't ignore Daisy's behavior. Sweat dripped down the mare's face, and her eyes were wide with concern. Even though Dr. Thompson was the veterinarian, Mrs. Johnson knew her horse through thick and thin, so when she got the feeling something wasn't right, she didn't just ignore it. She told Dr. Thompson again that something was wrong, but his response remained the same. That's when Mrs. Johnson knew she had to do something. She looked at her husband, and he could see his wife's worry, but what could they do? Dr. Thompson was at Daisy's side the whole time. Then Mr. Johnson suddenly knew what he had to do. He took a few steps backward, knowing something was behind him, and tripped on purpose. Mrs. Johnson and Dr. Thompson gasped when they heard Mr. Johnson fall. He screamed in pain, but it was exaggerated to grab Dr. Thompson's attention, which worked. The vet rushed over to help him up, but Mr. Johnson continued to moan, "My head. It hurts. I need to lie down." Dr. Thompson, unable to refuse, assisted him inside, glancing at Mrs. Johnson, hoping she would take over. However, Mrs. Johnson knew Daisy needed her, so she stepped into the stall. Immediately, Daisy's breathing calmed as Mrs. Johnson gently placed her hand on the horse's back, reassuring her that everything would be fine. Looking underneath Daisy's tail, she realized the foal was almost due, but something seemed wrong. Daisy had been in labor for a very long time, and the foal should have been here by now. Mrs. Johnson realized that Daisy was in labor with a breech foal, a serious situation that required immediate help. When Dr. Thompson returned, she explained the urgency, and he quickly called for additional veterinary assistance. A team of veterinarians arrived to assist with the complicated birth, carefully maneuvering the foal into the correct position to minimize risks for both Daisy and the foal. Meanwhile, Mrs. Johnson felt helpless and resentful toward the person responsible for Daisy's predicament. Determined to confront her neighbor, Philip, she angrily knocked on his door and demanded answers about the footage showing his stallion Rocky with Daisy. Philip, confused, eventually revealed that it was his daughter who had put Rocky in Daisy's stall. Just as Mrs. Johnson was about to ask more, she received a call from Dr. Thompson, urging her to return to the farm as the foal could arrive at any moment. "Where have you been?" Dr. Thompson asked. "Daisy is losing a lot of blood. The foal needs to come out immediately." The little hooves of the foal were already sticking out, but Daisy was exhausted from the long labor. She didn't have enough strength left to push on her own, so Dr. Thompson put a special chain around the foal's hooves to help Daisy. He watched her belly closely, and with every contraction, he gently pulled. It was a very stressful moment for everyone. Sweat dripped down Dr. Thompson's forehead as he gently pulled again with the next contraction. It finally looked like it was going in the right direction. The foal came out bit by bit, and Daisy seemed to be doing well considering the circumstances. "All right, one more push, Daisy," Dr. Thompson yelled. He braced himself for the final pull, and with that, the foal plunged to the ground. Everyone sighed in relief, but that changed quickly as the foal didn't move. Mrs. Johnson felt a lump form in her throat as she watched Daisy lick the foal. Those first minutes felt like an eternity. No one could take their eyes off the foal, who still hadn't moved. Mrs. Johnson was about to walk away when she saw a little movement, and that little movement grew bigger and bigger. Suddenly, the foal tried to get up. Mrs. Johnson hugged Dr. Thompson in relief. But not everyone had a big smile on their face. Dr. Thompson looked rather pale. "What are you thinking, doctor?" Mrs. Johnson asked worriedly. "That's not a regular foal," he carefully said. Mrs. Johnson frowned, but when she looked closer, she had to admit the foal looked very different from its parents. "What's wrong with it?" she asked the veterinarian. But before he had time to answer, Mrs. Johnson heard a car pulling up her driveway. Who could this be? Suddenly, Philip walked toward the front of the house, and everything clicked. He had called his daughter. "You," Mrs. Johnson yelled at the woman as she walked up to the stall. "You did this to my Daisy." "All right, calm down," Dr. Thompson said, trying to defuse the situation. "Who is this?" "I'm Philip's daughter, Tilly," the woman said. "She's the one who put Rocky together with Daisy," Mrs. Johnson yelled again. Tilly sighed. "Yes, I did it, but I'm not proud of it. I was in need of money, and knowing Rocky's parents, I figured this could make me a quick buck." Mrs. Johnson couldn't believe what she was hearing. "How were you planning to do that?" "Daisy is my horse. How would you make money from this?" Tilly looked down and nervously played with her fingers. "Well, my dad doesn't know this, but I did a DNA test on Rocky. We adopted him a long time ago without knowing what kind of horse he was, and I got curious. When the test results came back, I was shocked. Rocky wasn't just any horse. He was a Knabstrupper, a rare breed worth a lot of money. I knew this could help me because I was in a tough spot. But I loved Rocky too much to sell him, so I let him mate with Daisy. It was a silly plan, and I realized that too late. I wanted to take the baby horse as soon as it was born, but I knew that wouldn't work. I'm really sorry and kept checking on Daisy because I felt so guilty." "I'm not going to call the police, Tilly," Mrs. Johnson finally said. Everyone was confused by her sudden change. She had been so angry just moments before. "Today has been very stressful for all of us, and things could have turned out very badly, but they didn't. However, I'm asking you to leave my property and not come back," she said firmly. Tilly nodded, understanding why Mrs. Johnson made this request. She had broken their trust for her own selfish reasons, so she turned around and walked away without arguing. Daisy and her baby made a full recovery. Mrs. Johnson named the baby Dorothy, which means God's gift in Greek. Sometimes she let Rocky graze with them in the meadow. Mrs. Johnson never sold Daisy or Dorothy because she didn't care about the money. They all lived a long and happy life together.